Hello everybody and welcome. This is the 5th Google Hangout session of the Pixel Project's 4th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasivam. I'm your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning and best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign. We aim to raise $1 million for the cause to end violence against women. We have a lot of exclusive author goodies that we have put up on our Rally Up page for this Read for Pixels fundraiser, and I will tell you more about them a little later. But meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project, please go to thepixelproject.net. Okay, so for this session, we have a very special guest. I'm very excited about it. It's the talented, award-winning, and best-selling fantasy author Adrian Tchaikovsky. Adrian is the author of the Shadows of the Apt series, which comprises of 10 novels, and Echoes of the Fall series, as well as various standalone novels and short stories. So Adrian has also donated a whole bunch of stuff in collaboration with his publisher Macmillan Books, and we've put them all up on the Read for Pixels Rally Up page. So let me tell you what he's got. There are 3 bundles. Bundle 1 comprises 1 signed and personalized copy, a hardback copy of The Tiger and the Wolf, 1 signed and personalized hardback copy of The Bear and the Serpent, and 1 cartoon print drawn by Adrian himself. And this is normally only available to family and friends, and he will sign and personalize this as well. There are 4 sets of this bundle currently available. 1 has been snapped up, if I'm not mistaken. So that's bundle 1. Bundle 2 consists of a signed and personalized paperback copy of Children of Time, a signed and personalized paperback copy of Guns of Dawn, and 1 signed and personalized cartoon print drawn by Adrian himself. And there are 5 sets of this bundle available. Bundle 3 consists of 1 signed and personalized copy of Children of Time and 1 signed and personalized copy of The Guns of Dawn. That's paperback as well. There are 10 sets of this bundle available. Yeah, because a few have been snapped up already. So this is all thanks to the kindness and generosity of his publishers, and Penn Macmillan Books in the UK have agreed to ship these books worldwide. So these goodies are open to donors worldwide. They are happy to send the books and the goodies anywhere you are in the world. And we'd also like to take a quick moment to say thank you to Adrian's fans who so quickly donated to get their hands on a share of the goodies on offer. So these are Keith Domingue from Texas, USA, Trudy Chin from Toronto, Canada, Vinaya Kinsley from California, USA, Sonia Aldrini from Frankfurt, United Kingdom, Angelica Mars from California, USA, and Martin Torp from Denmark. I'm sorry if I said that wrongly. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for being so quick and donating. But there's so much more of Adrian's goodies available and other offer goodies as well. Now I will tell you guys how you can get your hands on them a bit later, so stay tuned for that. All funds that you donate go to the Pixel Project Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. So please do give generously. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking for a while because here is Adrian. Hi, Adrian.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
No problem at all.
So, Adrian, you are going to do a reading, and then after that we have a live discussion and a Q&A session. So I believe you're going to, actually I'm not sure what you're going to read, so just take it away.
Okay, I'm going to read you a section from my book Spiderlight, which is published by Tor.com in the US. Spiderlight is what I describe as a postmodern sort of quest fantasy. So it takes a lot of the tropes of your traditional Dungeons and Dragons style quest and turns on their heads. In the section I'm going to read, 2 of the questing characters, Harathes and Cyrene, are waiting for their leader, the priestess Dion, to emerge from a meeting with the head of her religion. They're in the heart of the City of the Light. And one of the things that the book plays a lot with is fantasy concepts of good and evil and how absolute they necessarily are. So let's kick it off. Cyrene was staring moodily out of the window, elbows on the sill. Heratheus studied the curve of her back, the elegant lines of her legs. He was a man who could hold two thoughts in his head simultaneously, sometimes contradictory ones. He was currently admiring his view of her and simultaneously thinking that as a respectable woman in the heart of the light, she should not just be slouching around. She should carry herself with more dignity. He himself was practically standing at attention. That sounded wrong to him, and actually, as his eyes were drawn inexorably down Cyrene's body with those leggings she would always wear, he became pointedly aware of the possibility that he might actually find himself standing to attention here in the potentate's antechamber. Quickly he turned away. There was always a problem with Cyrene. She was such a well-made woman, and yet so immodest. She should have more respect for men's passions. No wonder she was constantly attracting the wrong sort. Heratheus himself was a deeply devout man. He had been raised from an early age to know that he was of the light, and his actions were to defend the light. Without his sword, countless things of the dark would still be crawling and shambling in the world that he had put an end to. Without his shield, there would be many of the light who would have fallen victim to their depredations. He was a champion, the man who would stand between Dion and Darvisian the Dark Lord when the time came for that epic confrontation. It was reasonable enough, therefore, that he was entitled to a little consideration from the world, a little payment ahead of time. Virtue, after all, conferred a kind of entitlement. It was infuriating that Cyrene didn't see it that way. After all, she was notably less virtuous than he, having led a far more shadowy life before deciding to seek revenge on the dark by signing on with Dion. Surely she could see that she should not be seeking not vengeance, but redemption. She needed to step into the embrace of the light and learn to be happy there, instead of which she was maddeningly unpredictable. She had come to him once, and Heratheus had thought that was the end of it, but the moment he had tried to demonstrate that they were together, that she was safe and could allow herself to be shielded from the worst of the world, then she had pulled away from him again. And that louse-ridden ranger was not the first she had hooked onto either. Heratheus knew, with his heart's simple certainty, that such licentious behaviour was aimed at increasing his ardour. Of course, she was not really interested in those others, not since she had been his. Still, she was too wild. It was an attractive wildness, and it had drawn him to her, but at the same time the woman needed to let herself be guided a little. And here they were, in the heart of the light. Heratheus glanced around. The potentate's antechamber was simply appointed, which had surprised him. He had expected fountains of wine and scripture written in letters of gold and all that, but perhaps they'd been taken out for cleaning or something. There were some guards at the door they'd come in by, fellow warriors in the cause of the light in gleaming armour. There was also a string of junior priests sitting on a stone bench, waiting for Dion to come out so that they could bother the potentate with some piece of tedious bureaucracy. They all looked far too menial for Heratheus' purposes. The woman who obviously controlled access to the potentate was a more interesting prospect. She sat at a table beside his door, poring over a sheaf of paper that one of the little clerks had passed her. She looked to be close to 60. Her grey hair cut short like all those clerical types, with a lean and compact build. Her face had a distinct authority. Heratheus wandered over. "So, tell me, you're his potence's secretary?" he asked respectfully. She cocked an eye at him, and he had the awkward feeling that his question had been somewhat unnecessary. I am a servant of the destined one, the priestess Dion," he pointed out, in case the woman was unaware of his importance. She nodded patiently, papers held in her thin-fingered hands, pointedly waiting. "My companion and I will shortly venture into deepest darkness on behalf of blessed Armies and his church," Heratheus elaborated, sticking his chest out. "I was hoping that while our mistress seeks a blessing from the potentate, we might also receive the benediction of the church. Is there any chance you could send one of these for a priest, a senior priest?" The hard expression might have softened a little. "I understand," she told him. "I am myself the head of the Ordo Scriptian, as the potentate's secretary always is. I suspect I will be quite senior enough for you." There was a hint of a smile there. Heratheus suspected it with about as much a smile as she ever allowed herself. She had a formidable presence to her. Some words about whether a merely clerical priest would suffice or whether he wanted one of the warrior orders bubbled about in his head, but his common sense jumped them and kicked them back down again, because plainly this woman was very important indeed. Of course, those who served the potentate were themselves senior in the church. It made perfect sense to Heratheus that one way of showing importance was to have other important people performing menial or tedious tasks for you. Perhaps that said more than all the gilded archways in the world. "Cyrene," he called. The archer looked over from the window, glanced to see if Dion had made a reappearance, and then stared at him blankly. We are to be blessed, Herathis told her. We need all the help we can get, after all, given where we're going. She looked briefly surprised, but then nodded. That's good thinking, she agreed. He knew she was no congregation regular, but they, all of them, for their own reasons, were doing Armise's will and were reliant on his protection. Dion's radiant power had saved them more than once, and where they were going, it would be the only light in a very dark place. Having the approval of the church personally vouchsafed to them by a powerful priest would be an added measure of protection. So, Cyrene said, striding over, how does this work? Well, the secretary started, but Herathis coughed to draw her attention and put in, actually, given the unprecedented nature of our mission, I was hoping for something specifically tailored for us. The old woman did not seem approving, but at the same time was not discounting the possibility. Do you wish me to send someone to the archives to find an appropriate form, or... I've given it some thought, he explained, and it was true, although the thought had been very much concentrated in the last few minutes. We are to travel to a very terrible place, where the slightest hint of division between we fellow warriors of the light will surely spell our doom. It all sounded properly portentous, which is what he'd been aiming for. It is the bonds of comradeship that must be strengthened between us, so that the weaker of us do not stray. Would you want me to fetch Leaf and Penthos, then, or what? Cyrene broke in, regarding him doubtfully. No, Herathis replied hurriedly. Seriously, can you imagine either of them being fit for the blessing of armies? Any may be touched by the light if they are willing, the secretary started mildly. Yes, they're not, Herathis told her. Just the two of us, and we will have to set a good example for our less morally upright fellows, eh? A good example, no straying from righteousness, no wandering off. Now, hold on, Cyrene started, but her voice came out too loud, echoing in the bare chamber, and Herathis saw the attention of all those junior priests focus on her, clamping down on her words. We need a blessing that can bind us together, explained hurriedly to the secretary. We need the hand of armies on both of our shoulders, holding us close. Herathis, Cyrene spat, but he held an admonitory finger up to her. Remember where we are, he instructed, relying on the awe of the high temple to deal with any objections. Indeed, she seemed hardly able to speak, so he returned his attention to the secretary. We need to be as one in our divine mission, and where the one of us is the stronger vessel, the more perfect in his service to the light, then the weaker must take strength and guidance. That's the sort of blessing we need exactly. You can do that, right? She gazed into his face, perhaps his soul, and at last she seemed satisfied. Draw closer, she advised him. I shall enjoin your vow from you. She levered herself to her feet, leaning across the table so that he inclined himself to her automatically. You are a warrior of the light, she said softly, almost too quiet for him to hear. You go about a grand task that will result in the destruction of a monstrous evil. The footsteps you follow are of the heroes of old who risked all to defeat masters of darkness like Darvesian. You have risked much, suffered much, and no doubt there is far more suffering in store for you and your companions. Her voice was the merest breath, almost mesmerizing in its rhythms. For this reason, I lay on you the blessings of the church, which must often work through those vessels, weak or strong, that it finds. Let armies give strength to your sword and your shield, and let him lead you on a straight path through crooked places. Most of all, though, let him gift you with wisdom, because if you try that sort of trick near me again, I will have you hung by one thumb. And anyway, all this has given your companion ample time to get out of the room and probably the temple. What? Herathis exploded, jerking back from her and casting about for Cyrene, who was indeed conspicuous by her absence. Why, you... He checked himself off, abruptly aware of all the eyes that were upon him. I'll just... No doubt the priestess Dion will be with you shortly, the secretary told him, her voice brooking no disagreement. After that, no doubt you'll be good enough to escort her to her chambers and keep watch outside the door while she rests. It is a great honor to serve so. Ask anyone here. Thank you.
That was an amazing reading. It was very engaging. And I could just feel how slimy Herathis is. I don't know if you were looking, but I was making faces and I couldn't help it. So I'm actually going to jump straight into a question. Oh, actually, before I do that, I'm going to switch the screen to me. Hi, everyone. If you guys are watching, now is your chance to ask Adrian questions. So you can type your questions up in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Our chat box moderator, Regina, is ready. She's going to relay the questions to me. I'm looking at chat box as well, but she's going to relay the questions to me in case we miss anything, and I'll read them out to Adrian, who will answer them. So go ahead. But we also have a lot of questions of our own. So here is one I'm going to start with, which kind of relates to the excerpt that you read. Now you've got so many kinds of characters in all your books. Some of your male protagonists are not typical heroes. They're not big, strong warrior types who think with their swords, but they're more intellectual academic men and boys who tend to shy away from overt violence. But then you've created protagonists who are anti-heroes, like Harates, who you just saw. He's so sexist and he's racist as well. Was this a deliberate move to show how people like this think and how their actions impact others, and perhaps how ridiculous they can be? Because Harates is kind of ridiculous in his self-absorption and his belief that women need governing.
Yeah, I mean, Harates is definitely a bit of a figure of fun. I mean, I guess I hadn't really thought of him as an anti-hero, just because I guess it's not. I guess really because it's not even his. It's not his story per se. He's one of sort of a party of six, who are off to fight the Dark Lord, and he is by far the most objectionable of them. And at the end of the day, I suppose, unlike a lot of characters like that I've written, he is at least doing the right thing in the sense of he's off to defeat a genuine evil. But at the same time, the point of him, especially in regard to the general sort of morality story that's going on in Spiderlight, is that because he knows that he is good in a very sort of Dungeons and Dragons alignment sort of sense, and because he knows he is of the light, everything he does to him, by his view, is a good thing. And he's not the only character in that particular book that does this. You have a number of the people who are ostensibly on the side of the light, who are quite happy to do quite appalling things, because they believe their position in the world gives them the justification and gilds any of their actions with that kind of virtue. And yes, with Harates, we do see it in particular with his attitude to women and to Cyrene in particular, which is extremely possessive and his, I guess, his opinion of himself, which is ludicrously overcompensatory, shall we say.
Yeah.
And because Spiderlight is fairly light-hearted, I get to do that. I get to play that for laughs quite a lot with Harates as the butt of the joke. But there are certainly other characters where that whole kind of dynamic is being played much more seriously, and it's it comes over as considerably less light-hearted than that. I think it's as part of the general dynamic of breaking out from that. From, I suppose, the traditional straight fantasy narrative where the character like Harates would actually be the hero. And because he is fighting the Dark Lord, he would be entitled to get the girl at the end of it. It is kind of important to be able to turn that on its head and show what a fairly sort of poisonous assumption that really is.
Yeah, I see that. And like you said, there are other characters as well who do this, and there are characters who are good characters, heroes, who are not warriors, like I said before. Did you create these characters, the good ones and the not so good ones, as a move to break tropes and also address toxic masculinity and the violence and pain and havoc that it brings, including violence against women?
I certainly I tried to give quite a wide range of characters. I think I had a big advantage in that because I was starting off in my writing career with an epic fantasy series that ran for 10 books.
Mm-hmm.
There is in the same way as in Game of Thrones or in the Malazan books from Erickson, there is an enormous number of characters there, and so I get to explore an awful lot of different archetypes and sort of counter archetypes. So although I have my kind of my men of violence in there, both heroes and villains, I also get to have characters like, I mean, in Shadows of the Apt, we've got Stemwald Maker, who is a statesman and an engineer and a scholar, and who accomplishes considerably more than his colleague Tissamon, who is the kind of the incomparable duelist. Although, I mean, from general audience reaction, Tissamon is by far the reader favorite, I suppose, which is, I don't know what that says. Stenwald is my favorite, though.
I do like Stenwald. I think Tissamon is this, like you said, this archetypical warrior, like silent, strong type. But Stenwald is amazing as well because, like you said, there's so many layers to him.
Yes, and I mean, and because he's got 10 books, obviously Stenwald himself changes. I mean, one of the things I try to do with with even my small characters, I guess, is I try to make them rounded and I try to give them a place in the world. I mean, my own writing technique is very rooted in creating the world first and letting things arise out of the world, and therefore I think that helps in giving me characters who do vary, because you have characters who play to a certain cultural archetype, and in Shadow of the Apt, one of the main differences between a lot of the characters is how you have that gender balance dealt with. So, for example, the Wasp Empire, who are the main antagonists, are extremely patriarchal, but there is also there are some matriarchal cultures, and there are some cultures where there is a more or less of a balance. And so, because I've got that set up in the world, that means I get to play with characters who are playing to type, as it were, in the way that they deal with in the way that they deal with the opposite sex, and I have characters who are playing against that. And I made sure that although the Wasps are a patriarchal society, there are a lot of female Wasps in the books at various ranks, from the very lowest to to the very highest, and that the patriarchal empire ends up with an empress.
Yeah. Many people in the anti-violence against women movement say that male violence is the main, if not the root cause of violence against women and girls, and of violence in general as well. How do you think science fiction and fantasy stories like yours can help move this conversation forward in a constructive way?
I think science fiction and fantasy is uniquely placed to explore the issues. I mean, because you're inventing the axioms of your world, whether it's a sort of a far future world, or whether it's an entirely imaginary secondary world. You can put your finger in the scales any way you want, depending on what you want to show. You can take an extremely oppressive and unpleasant patriarchal society by exaggerating the problems of the real world and highlight them that way. You can flip it around and have a society where there is a genuine equality for whatever reasons, and you get the opportunity of exploring all the reasons why that equality isn't necessarily there in the real world and how it could be brought about. I think we, in our particular genre, we have the best opportunities to take this really in any direction you want. The real shame is when you come across a book where someone hasn't thought about it, is just basically following the standard narrative of, oh well, it's kind of medieval and the men are kind of in charge and they do all the things and the women are there to be married off and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And that then becomes disappointing because it's a missed opportunity. It doesn't need to change the entire story you want to tell just to have a situation where women even get to do the things they genuinely did in the Middle Ages, let alone, rather than the things that people perceive that they did in the Middle Ages, mm-hmm. or more than that. You can do that with how you do your magic, or you can do that with just having your fantasy societies grow up in a different way, or having your extra solar colony have been set up in a slightly different way. It doesn't have to be so rooted in the way that other genres are potentially rooted in how the modern world works.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I asked this question previously to Ken Liu because he had a discussion, he had discussed this before with other people. Do you think that it's unrealistic to depict women in power in fiction because it doesn't really reflect the real world or our real history.
Well, I'm sitting here in a country where we have a female prime minister, and although I may not agree with that, she's the second one we've had, and I know that there are a lot of female premiers in the world at the moment. There have also been plenty of historical figures, female rulers of countries, commanders of armies, and beyond that, you have all the women we know who were revealed to be women later on in their lives after having, say, successful military careers. And if you think about that, you must realize that obviously a lot of those that we have never found out that must also have existed. I don't think it is ahistorical. I think that if you are writing in a setting that has elements of history and you want to expand the role of women from what is historically perceived, you may want to have reasons why that is the case. I mean, taking a very simple historical reason, we had a great big plague. Obviously, we had a number of plagues historically in the Middle Ages, and they killed a lot of working men, and women had to step up to fill the gap. So that's instant historical, ready-made way of, if you want to write a book in a historical setting where women are a lot more active than they might otherwise be, there you go. That's one for free, as it were. And obviously, and if you're writing fantasy, if you're writing science fiction, and obviously, firstly, the more modern you get, the less reason there is to say, well, this sort of role is only male, because we are far less. There are far fewer roles that necessarily require you. Well, you need to be able to lift a certain amount of weight in order to do this job. But also, I mean, as fantasy, one of the things I've got, for example, my aunt Kindon in Shadows of the Apt are all telepathic amongst their own sort of cities. They are a completely equal opportunities employer, because being in each other's minds all the time, they are absolutely aware that there isn't really that huge difference between thought patterns or capability, men to women, and therefore everything is an absolutely equal split with them. And that's a fantasy element which bridges that gap equally well.
And you're right, with fantasy especially, you can create societies that any kind of society. They don't have to. It doesn't have to reflect the real world or our history. It could be anything you want. But speaking of women, quite a few of your protagonists are women, and the female characters in your stories are well-rounded, motivated characters. They have distinct personalities. There are women who are confident and dominant. There are those who are quiet and submissive. There are women whose personalities and attitudes evolve as their story progresses. So who or what inspires you to create these women characters?
I think to a certain extent, I mean, as befits someone who also, for example, writes books whose protagonists are spiders, I try and take the road less traveled. And certainly when I was writing a lot of my early books, if who is a fantasy protagonist? A fantasy protagonist is almost always a man, whether it is the kind of unbeatable warrior type, or whether it is the prophesied sort of Belgarian, the special boy, who they're almost always men. And it's certainly, by no means universal. And I'm not saying that I made any kind of special invention to when setting out to write stories about female characters, but it just seemed to me that, well, that hasn't been done as much as the male protagonists. I might as well do that so I can carve out a bit more sort of unique narrative space. And that's why, the lead character in the Shadows of the Apt books, although it is very much an ensemble cast, is Cheerwell Maker. And then I've got Emily Marshwick in Guns of the Dawn, so I'm just looking over at my bookshelf so I have to remember my own books. I've got Manier in Tiger the Wolf. And so, yes, I mean, I've gone, I think, probably about 60-40 on female to male protagonists so far. And, it's one of the, as things have gone on, I've become more aware of the real world political issues. It continues to be attractive to me to do that, just because I feel that I'm in some way redressing a balance that is, you know, decidedly weighted the other way.
Well, fantasy has, as any genre, has its tropes and stereotypes. How do you work around stereotypes to create female characters who are empowered and have agency in dealing with the world around her, including situations that involve sexism, misogyny, violence against women and girls?
I think the best sort of actual working technique I've got is going back to having that awareness of the world. I think it's one of those, if you know how the world you're writing in works, it becomes, I think, a lot harder to simply follow the standard tropes, because you've basically pulled up the hood and you've looked at the engine, and you can see I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it. You can see how, even if let's say we're looking at the Wasp Empire, which is my hostile patriarchy in the Shadows of the Apt again. Looking at how it's grown up, looking at its origins and all the the work I put into creating it. There's no kind of divine right of masculinity going on there. It's something that's arisen out of distinct imbalances in the culture early on that have been perpetuated into the period shown in the books. And once you know that, it gives you a much better handle of, well, how do the female characters manage? I mean, how do whether they are slaves or whether they are wives or whether they are, I mean, the most prominent one is Seda, who's the who becomes the Empress quite early on in the series, and then basically has to deal with the fact that she is the first ever female ruler of a very male-dominated state. And I mean, the other thing is, of course, although I have had there are plenty of male characters in my books who are of that kind of patriarchal viewpoint, or who are sort of violent towards women. It's a matter of, it's not dealt with casually. I certainly hope I have never sort of fridged a female character just to give a male character a bit of motivation. I certainly hope I've never written a rape scene purely to make a villain seem more villainous, because those are tropes I find kind of rather abhorrent. So it's a matter of, when you do have that sort of situation come up in the books, it's meaningful, and also generally, the guy doesn't get away with it.
Yeah. We got a question from Regina, who asks, what are the particular challenges that you face as a male author when you write female characters?
This is tricky, because I like to think I do reasonably good female characters. People have certainly told me so, for what that's worth. My rather lazy answer to the question is, I just try and write the character, and again, the character based on the world that they come from, based on the the culture and the upbringing and the background that they've had. And the main thing that's going to impact, specifically because of their gender, is going to be arising out of the culture they come from. So I think I take a standpoint with the character, male or female, in pretty much the same way, and it's really just the lens of their cultural background that will put gender specific changes on them. So, which I suspect is not a terribly useful or comprehensive answer, but I don't have any sort of special magic for getting in touch with my feminine side or anything like that.
Okay. No, it makes sense, because if you think about it, people are people, right? And most of the time, well, okay, I was going to say most of the time your gender doesn't inform your character, but then actually kind of does in this world. So, I mean, Because
Sorry,
of
go
the
on.
way society, because of the way you are forced to interact with society, whether you're a woman or a man, it's different. You get what I mean?
And one other thing I have, my kind of my safety net is I generally get my wife to read most of my manuscripts before I submit them, and every so often she just come across something and say, well, this doesn't feel natural coming from a female character, and at that point I go back and rewrite it. So that's kind of my fallback. And the areas that's usually when I'm writing about from a female character's point of view in respect of something romantic. So I think that's probably the thing that's challenged me most as a male writer, writing from a female point of view.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, we're gonna go back to you. We were talking about violence just now, about warrior societies like the WAFs, and your Shadows of the Apt and Echoes of the Fall series are set in times of war, or where war is brewing, and like you said, there are peoples who are warrior societies and warrior cultures. This means that there is a fair amount of violence in stories, including violence against women. So your story, your stories have included scenes of violence against women, including forced marriage and rape or sexual assault. Now you said you try not to do it gratuitously, but do you actually deliberately include these scenes to sort of show that these things can happen, or do they kind of
Yes.
develop organically as part of the plot?
Yes. I mean, I think that it's a very tricky. I mean, it's a tricky situation because you don't want to have a book that's filled with these sort of scenes just because it is something that happens in the real world, because it can very quickly become not just gratuitous, but effectively sort of wallowing in that kind of. I mean, there's a sort of there's an area of fantasy fiction anyway, which which is generally referred to as grimdark, which, if left unchecked and taken to its extreme, can become a kind of a misery porn in which these things are just shown as some sort of manifestation of the callous universe, which is not the sort of thing I tend to enjoy reading, and it's certainly not the sort of thing I enjoy writing. But on the other hand, I feel that it would be dishonest to have a situation where you've got that kind of a world and there will be no mention of it at all, because it is a thing that happened in the real world, and writing about it to condemn it, or writing about it to highlight the fact that it does happen and to put it in the most banal sense that it is a bad thing, seems to me to be a reasonable step to go. And so, I mean, for example, in Guns of the Dawn, which is a sort of I think it's been described by a friend of mine as Pride and Extreme Prejudice. It's a Jane Austen-y sort of setting where the female lead character ends up signing on with the army because her nation is getting into a kicking in the war and has basically started conscripting women. So you get women entering a previously entirely male armed force right into a conflict. And I could have written that with her not having any kind of difficulty in that line, but I think it would have been unrealistic. And so it's part of her overall experience of the horrors of war, is not just the fact that she's having to fight and kill in what is in fact also an extremely unpleasant sort of terrain environments. They're fighting in swamp country, so it's very it's a horrible condition to fight in. But also, of course, she has problems simply with people on her own side, though, and she has and you see the various ways she deals with that, because she does deal with it, and she deals with it very, very successfully. But I think it would be somewhat mendacious of me to pretend that I've got that sort of setup in a book which is at least trying to be naturalistic and then not have anything happen like that at all. But it's a very fine line, and it can be a difficult choice of what precisely how to address that.
How do you find the balance between showing this violence as an integral part of the story and giving readers a realistic depiction of the violence and not showing it for violence for its own sake? Is there a formula that you use?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably worth drawing on the basis that an awful lot of fantasy fiction, and certainly heroic and epic fantasy, is violence, full stop. I mean, it is the genuine sort of dispute resolution method of choice for almost everyone in the business. There's violence in general, and there's violence. I think that the specific violence against women aspect is something that I tend to separate out and treat differently, because I just feel I've got to tread far more carefully in that line. Whereas if I can use rather horribly, the everyday violence of a fantasy story involving kind of either individuals or entire nations at war, whether the protagonists there are male or female, because I do tend to have quite a lot of sort of frontline female fighters in Shadows of the Apt and in various other books. I think there it becomes a matter of, simply because some of the fighters are women, it doesn't really affect the way I would approach a battle, because at that point their importance to the plot is more in their roles as combatant than in what gender they are. And yeah, I mean, as I said, as far as dealing with the more generic violence that fantasy fiction tends to espouse, that's really a whole topic in and of itself as to what you do and how much and how you show it. Because I think there is, and certainly in fantasy at the moment, there is definitely a philosophy about going into the violence of wars, especially to show how confusing and frightening and senseless they are. It's one of the things you see really well in, say, Joe Abercrombie's The Heroes, where you've got large battles, but you're seeing them entirely from one person's point of eyes, and you have no sense of the wider scale. It's all this confused series of mishaps and blunders and momentary clashes where you have where the character you're seeing it from has no control over what's going on. I think that's probably a rather honest way of depicting how a battle must actually have been.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, so let's kind of move on to the bigger picture. As a novelist, how important is it, in your opinion, to have strong female characters, not just in novels, but in pop culture as a whole?
I think it's important because I think we're in because I mean, like as I was saying before, like if you don't, it is a missed opportunity, and we're in a position as creators of narrative to redress a balance that has for a very, very long time been all about telling men's stories about men, and with very little role for women at all. And therefore, while we still tell men's stories and we tell stories about tell stories about men, it's open to us to also tell women's stories about women, and it's open to us to, even if we are telling a story about a man, having women fill some of the supporting roles and the surrounding roles that would traditionally all have been 100% masculine. And it's one of the things I've written. I've recently finished a read through of the most recent, say, sort of batch or generation of fantasy authors here in the UK. About half a dozen authors who all were published this year, fairly close on each other's heels. And it is interesting that although there's a lot of return and exploration of sort of previous plot structures and previous styles, there's a lot more diversity in something that almost all of those writers are producing, in terms of gender balance of characters, in terms of balance of, say, sexuality of characters, and things like that, in a way that I've not necessarily seen that much in the past. So it is kind of encouraging to see that the idea that you can have sort of female characters operating at various levels in a plot, who are not simply to be rescued or to be threatened or to be a magic special character who has to be kind of carried like a football through the plot until they can do their thing at the touchline. So instead, I'm seeing a lot of, if you've got a bunch of characters who are warriors, some of them are going to be female, and without anyone being particularly, without it being a special thing. They're not like the special female guard of the moon goddess or something like that. That's the way it is.
Sorry, that's that was a motorbike revving outside the window. I'm sorry. Please go on.
Where were we?
You were saying that the women characters they're not special because they're women.
Yeah, and I mean that's certainly what I've tried to do throughout the Shadows of the Apt series. Again, with an eye to the culture people are coming from. So if you have a culture like Collegium, which is the main kind of hero culture in the series, it's not entirely egalitarian. Actually, it's as you go through, you realize that an awful lot of the people at the top are still men, but it's still considerably more. It gives considerably more equality than the WASP do, and so when you get to see their academics or their kind of volunteer soldiers and so forth, an awful lot of them are women. You have female pilots when you get to the air war part of the series, and the reason for that is no more than simply because they've got no particular reason not to. Who wants to defend your home city? Everyone does, and it's not it's not purely a thing that there isn't that cultural tradition that all soldiers are mostly men, and it's which is something that we still have today in our society, although it's becoming less so as gradually as time goes by.
Do you think it's important for influential authors such as yourself, who are read all over the world, to make a conscious effort to include diversity, like what you were talking about, and to include characters, both male and female, who show readers the importance of respecting women as equals and as human beings?
I do. I mean, this is a controversial point. You see it argued backwards and forwards on sort of blogs and forums and things, and a lot of people get very hot under the collar about the idea of what fictional positive discrimination, I suppose, and the idea that you're just putting these women in to score a political point, or
diversity pandering.
And to a certain extent, I suppose that is what you're doing. I mean, but I think it's because it's a valid political point, and because I do think there is an imbalance that, in my minuscule way, I can add some weight to the other side of. I think it is something that we should do, and it's one of those. It's the bit you get that standard sort of complaint, especially, and this is especially a fantasy thing. There are people who say, "Well, I'm afraid, when you have your women doing this sort of traditionally male thing, I find that completely unbelievable. But the bit with the dragons was fine." And you say that you're writing fantasy. There's no, by all means, think it through. There are definitely real world things that are a potential issue. It's one of the in the Shadows of the Apt, for example, there are readily available things like contraceptives are readily available, and that's potentially an important social thing towards the emancipation of women. But it's a fantasy world, so why not? You can have them growing on every tree if you want. It's
exactly.
And that and if you find that is the sticking point of your imagination, while the dragons and the wizards and the flying cities and whatever aren't, then that it's that might cause a little self-reflection as to why it's that you find so difficult to swallow.
So certain people in science fiction and fantasy say that this kind of diversity pandering is resulting in lackluster stories that are not in line with the spirit of science fiction and fantasy. What do you think is the spirit of science fiction and fantasy?
I mean, the big thing I feel is that science fiction and fantasy needs to be original. It needs to go places that hasn't necessarily been before. there is a lot of lackluster science fiction fantasy, but there is a lot of lackluster everything. It's, you know, it's for every person that looks over at fantasy and says, oh, it's all about dragons and swords and things. There are people who can look from fantasy over to serious literature and say, oh, it's all about sort of middle-aged college professors having a midlife crisis. And it's in both cases they're wrong, but in both cases there are definitely overtired tropes with pretty much everything you do, and there's a lot of lackluster, patriarchal and male-dominated science fiction and fantasy. I'm sure there is lackluster, diverse, and sort of more equalitarian fantasy, because that's just how things tend to fall out. We're not every book is going to be a phenomenal masterpiece, and there are going to be and it is entirely possible that there are some books out there who are purely trying to jump on a perceived bandwagon, but I don't think that's a reason not to work to be more actively diverse in creating fantasy world, because frankly, more diverse worlds are more interesting. Politics aside, a world that is not just another humdrum MGM looking medieval Europe is likely to be more interesting than just, it's all sort of, it's, there are some feudal politics, and it all looks like a bit like a bad knockoff of Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones is popular. Yeah. There's going to be a scale of artistic quality everywhere you look, but one assumes the people who are complaining about this were not complaining about the fact when everyone was basically doing Tolkien ripoffs about manly men charging about killing Dark Lords and saving the world.
How do you think authors can strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about sexism and gender-based violence and telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
I think the key thing there is it's about telling the story. If the story you're telling is good enough, you don't need to really, unless the story is for some reason intrinsically about the role of men and women in the world, in which case you've probably got it covered already because you've already given that a lot of thought. It doesn't necessarily need enormous sweeping changes or some sort of political high horse in order to get that point across. You can do that diversity really quite subtly. I mean, in the bit that I read from Spiderlight, I'm obviously quite deliberately highlighting Harathes as a character, but that's the biggest focus that side of him gets. It's a kind of a constant undercurrent whenever you're seeing things from his point of view, or for that matter, whenever Cyrene is getting particularly angry with him, and it comes out in the conflict between Harathes and the spider character, who he really doesn't like, because he, as you say, he's also a bigot in a number of other ways, as well as his attitudes towards Cyrene. But it's not the main thrust of the book. The main thrust of the book is broader than that, and encompasses the whole sort of good-evil split and what the Dark Lord actually is, and the journey of the spider character Nth. And so I don't feel that in having Harathes and in being able to give that look on to his rather unpleasant and self-entitled point of view in any way compromises the rest of the book. In the same way that I don't feel that having a lot of female characters at various levels necessarily detracts from any of the stuff that goes on in Shadows of the Apt, and sometimes it adds because it gives you another view of a culture. So, for example, in one of the later books, you have a female wasp character who has done that join the army disguised as a man business, and so you get to see the entire sort of wasp empire thing. And she's a very loyal imperial soldier as well. She's not a kind of a subversive fifth colonist. She's absolutely dedicated to the empire winning the war, even though if her secret was found out, they would put her on the crossed pikes. And so, but you get to see that whole thing from her point of view and the extra precautions she has to take. And then later on, you get the first female WASP pilot, for example, because she has a particular ability that they need, and therefore they're forced to overlook the gender that would normally exclude her from that. And so, I mean, it's one of those, I don't think you need to be preachy, but if you do embrace that, one thing is it gives you a whole extra toolkit to explore your fantasy world with, I suppose is where I've gone with that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there are a rising number of prominent and well-respected and well-known female authors in science fiction and fantasy and in geek culture. And there are also, you were talking about just now, the dominant, there's lots and lots of male heroes. A lot of stories feature male main characters, but there are a rising number of female characters, especially in young adult novels.
Yeah.
But there are still critics that say that geek culture in general is still too male dominated. What do you think needs to be done or can be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I think that the genre, the various parts of the genre at their own different rates have been traveling in the right direction for a while. And I think one of the reasons we've seen some sort of area-specific anti-equality backlashes is simply the recognition that greater equality has started to impact on the people who previously had it all their own way. And so, I mean, I don't know if this is too complacent, but to a certain extent, carrying on as we have been doing and creating more diverse worlds and not simply falling back into old habits of manly men doing manly things, as it were, is one part of it. And the other part of it is simply standing up for those principles when they are challenged, when you have something like the whole the whole puppies business with the Hugo Award and things like that. It's a matter of holding on to what has been achieved in the face of that kind of attack.
Okay.
And you kind of, I mean, one hopes there will also be a certain amount of snowballing going on, because as a given genre, whether it's gaming or whether it's books or whatever, becomes friendlier towards, say, women readers or women gamers or moviegoers or whatever it is that you're trying to target, then more of them will come, and there'll be a filter within the commercial part of that organization that suddenly says, actually, there is a whole market here that we've not necessarily been catering for, but we can cater for more. And so one hopes that there'll be a certain level of self-reinforcement going on. But I've got to say, I'm not in any way an expert on how this sort of social change goes about. That really comes more under how I hope things will go. Cross fingers it doesn't all end up back in the Dark Ages again.
Well, we all hope so. And do you think one of the reasons violence against women exists is gender inequality? Do you think there will ever be a time in this world where there will be complete equality between the genders?
I would hope so. I mean, there's kind of the holy grail of sort of all-round social and gender and sexuality and everything equality is probably Ian Banks's culture novels, which give this kind of completely idealized society where everyone is on a par and where everyone can be whatever they want to be, and if they don't like it, they can change it and be someone else, which includes gender for that matter. And it would be nice to think that at some point we would achieve that kind of complete acceptance of people for their own sake. We are working against a very long history of it not being so, and there's always this kind of these two currents of there is the conservatism trying to pull people back to what was seen, to some sort of mythical golden age where things were correctly ordered, and whether that's sort of based on religious doctrine or whether that's based on simply some starry-eyed view of the past. It certainly exists, and we're very much in the throes of it at the moment. I mean, we're seeing, I think, a huge reactionary rush, certainly in the English-speaking world, that is seeking to restore, in inverted commas, traditional values, which I kind of hope we get past soon, because it's building up to rather worrying levels. And from my personal standpoint, the fact that those traditional values also sort of trivialize and diminish the view of scientific knowledge in the world is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But it is interesting the fact that so often seems to go hand in hand with that kind of, and it's all for men, and we're not going to have there's no such thing as transgender, and no diverse sexuality, and it's all got to be back. Everything has got to be nailed down in small boxes. And the way a lot of these things always seem to fall out on the same lines is telling. I think there are people who need to look around and just see who it is that they're linking arms with at that point. But I'd like to think we're going to get past it. I'd like to think that there will be a counter reaction, or however it is, and that every time we do get out from under that cloud of reactionary conservatism, we'll push the boundary a little more towards complete equality.
Now, speaking of the future, parents are usually the most influential role models in a person's life. You're a father yourself. Mm-hmm. How do you think parents can help to prevent violence against women and girls in future generations, and to get boys involved in helping to do this?
Yes, one of the there was a thing when the Wonder Woman movie came out. I can't remember who, but someone posted up on Twitter, "It's wonderful that there is this role model for girls." This very high-profile female superhero, and my response to that was, it's also wonderful that there is that role model for boys. That, my son is growing up with plenty of female protagonists in the things he reads, as well as male ones, and he's certainly. Frankly, it's. My wife does all the DIY in the house, and my wife is the one of us that drives the car and things like that. So he's not coming from this very traditional men do this and women do that sort of family home environment anyway. But there are thankfully plenty of female-led books. Television is more problematic, actually. That's one of a lot of the kids' television he watches. I'm kind of looking over and thinking, yeah, that's not so grand an example. And it's not that they're not there, but there's still an awful lot of, this is a bunch of people, and there's one female character, and her particular speciality is that she is the female character. It's like the very, very early X-Men, where Jean Grey was basically, she was there because she was the girl. And there is still a certain amount of that about, and for that matter, a certain amount of shows where there isn't really a female character at all. But certainly with the books he gets, and a lot of the other media he consumes, we do kind of try and we do try and ensure that he has that balance, so that he doesn't just growing up thinking, well, if there was a story and there was a hero of the story, that hero is always a man. Which, a generation ago might well have been the sort of thing that you grew up utterly without questioning.
Okay. So, believe it or not, we've actually spent an hour talking.
Blimey.
So I am gonna ask my last question. So you, Adrian, you've been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work in general. Can you tell us why you support the cause to end violence against women and how you think authors like yourself can best support efforts to kick off social change to end violence against women?
I mean, I think violence. You said earlier the idea violence in women. The chief problem with violence against women is violence by men. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at a problem of which I am of the demographic that perpetuates this problem. I am, to a certain extent, because I have all the advantages of birth, of being a man in a society where that's pretty much incontestably a better thing to be than a woman, because of the way people will react to you, because of the opportunities you have. I think that does impose something of a positive duty on me to try and redress the balance. And I feel that doing that by writing interesting fantasy settings where I can explore the issue, or simply where women get the chance to be a bit more than they necessarily do in, I don't know, the fantasy books of a generation ago, it's a small enough thing for me to do. And it doesn't, I don't think it's not as if I'm making some great sacrifice by doing it even, but no, no, I'm helping, I think, in some tiny way.
You are, definitely are. I mean, every little thing that people like you do, is just helping to spread the word actually does help a lot. And that actually brings us to the end of our session. Before I switch the screen to me, I think, Adrian, you have some announcements you want to make.
Yes, I have 3 books coming up in the near future. Firstly, for those who have been reading The Tiger and the Wolf and The Bear and the Serpent, which is one of my sort of female-led fantasy series, the 3rd one of that is coming out in February of next year, which is the Hyena and the Hawk. That's coming out from Pan Macmillan. I also have coming out in November of this year, there is a novella from Solaris called Ironclads, which is near-future military science fiction. And I have a novel from Head of Zeus called Dogs of War, which is a book about bioengineered animal soldiers. Both of which have their complement of female characters. And so, yes, if you like my books, then those are the ones that are coming out next.
Oh, that's exciting. Okay, so here I am again, guys. Now, I promised earlier to tell you how you can get your hands on all of Adrian's goodies that he's donated. They're all on our Rally Up page. So as I mentioned earlier, he's donated 3 separate goodie bundles, several sets of each. And so the first bundle is it includes a signed and personalized copy of The Tiger and the Wolf and a signed and personalized copy of The Bear and the Serpent, and one signed and personalized cartoon print drawn by Adrian, which is normally only available to friends and family, but you can get it. Okay, bundle number 2 is signed and personalized paperback copy of Children of Time and signed and personalized copy of Guns of Dawn and a cartoon print drawn by Adrian, also signed and personalized, which you can't get anywhere else. And bundle 3 has a signed and personalized copy of Children of Time and a signed and personalized copy of The Guns of Dawn. So there are still lots of these bundles left, so please hurry on up to our Rally Up page. And besides Adrian's stuff, there are also plenty more author goodies. We have stuff from Elliot de Bodart, Charles Villand, Karen Rose, Genevieve Valentine, Ken Liu, Isaac Marion, so many more. And we will be releasing the goodies in weekly batches. So check back on Fridays throughout September for new goodies going up. And please do note that some goodies are available only for US donors, while others are for donors worldwide. Adrian's is for worldwide donors. So please do check before you select your video of choice. Okay, so here is how you do it. I'm going to share a slide with you guys. And hopefully you can see it. Hold on. Sorry, I'm trying to call it up. Here we go. Okay. Can you see that, Adrian?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay. So go to our Rally Up page. The address is is.gd/r4p Rally Up 2017. And if you want to find out more about Read for Pixels or the other sessions that we have coming up, please go to is.gd/read4pixels. And if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project in general and about our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign, please do go to www.thepixelproject.net. So, should be back again, hopefully I'm back on screen. Okay, so now all that's left to do is to thank you, Adrian. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you people who watch and people who are going to be watching this later. Yeah, and I hope you had a good time, Adrian, because I certainly did. And thank you for supporting us. Thank you for supporting the Plastic Inland Film.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And so now let's also just say goodbye to everybody. Bye, Adrian, and goodbye, viewers. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.